Hello, SI leaders. Welcome to Learning Theory for SI leaders. My name is Dr. Christina Jensen. I'm a former SI student, SI leader, and the former assistant coordinator of the Supplemental Instruction program here at ETSU. Before beginning this video, I hope you have all taken a look at the worksheet that I put together to go with the video for you. Parts 1 and 2 are meant to be done prior to watching the video, so if you haven't done that yet, go ahead and pause the video, hop back over to the worksheet, and take a look at those terms and questions so that we can sort of be on the same page with that going into the curriculum. But other than that, let's get started.
All right, here we are, Learning Theory for SI leaders. Again, my name is Dr. Christina Jensen, and let's get to it. So we have a lot that I'd like to accomplish with you all today. My goal here is I'd like to introduce to formalize awareness of the learning process and the components that influence whether successful learning will occur. So the learning process is something that has been studied extensively academically, and we have a structured framework to approach this process. And I think if you all have an understanding of that process going in to your plannings, to your sessions, dealing with students, I'm hoping that that will really help set you up for success in how you spend your energy on this. My hope is that this is going to enable you all to better anticipate and understand your students' needs and struggles. I think we've all had that conversation with a student who's working really hard and is just really not understanding what it is that we're laying down. And, you know, at some point you're just like, I don't know how to help you anymore. But if you have that structured framework to think about learning, I'm hoping that that will help inform those conversations and help you meet those challenges a little bit more confidently. So our agenda that we're going to cover in this module is we're going to consider the relationship between your role as an SI leader and the learning process. We're going to examine the 4 elements that influence learning. Those are the 4 elements according to the academic study of learning theory. We're going to dive into those a bit. And then we're going to use those to strategize practical ways to intentionally influence whether learning will occur. So where do we start then, right? Where do we start when we're trying to get into some new material? Well, we've got to start somewhere, right? And those of you who have ever had any trainings with me before know that I like to ask 2 questions. These are the magic questions in my mind that help us sort of guide where the rest of the session needs to go and what we need to cover. And those questions are, what do we know? And why do we care? So what do we know? What is it that we're talking about? Where is our baseline? And why are we talking about it? How does it fit into the bigger picture of what it is that we're trying to do? So when we're looking at SI, what do we know about SI? We know that SI seeks to create active learning opportunities through creative and cooperative group study. And that is a quote from me from a previous video that I made for you. And that is how I see the mission of SI. So if our objective is to facilitate learning, to create learning opportunities, what do we know about learning? How does learning work? Because understanding the nuts and bolts of that process is going to inform how we go about creating those opportunities. One of the questions that I put on your worksheet that hopefully you all looked at prior to beginning this video is I'm asking you to consider what are some different learning styles that you are already aware of. So this idea that there are different learning styles out there, I'm sure is not new to any of us. And I'm sure that we have all, met the person who is more left-brained or right-brained or type A or whatever the case may be. I think we all have seen this phenomenon in action that learning works differently for everybody. And so we want to keep that in mind as we go forward. In terms of actual academic models of learning styles, here are just a couple of them. And each of these graphics could have an entire lesson dedicated to it. So we are really just scratching the surface on all of this. My point for including this in our conversation today is not to draw your attention to any particular type of learning style or any particular model, but to understand that this is something that has been extensively studied, extensively researched in an academic way, and pretty much all of these you'll notice are operating on a spectrum. And so, like here in the top left corner, we've got our kinesthetic learners. These are the people who like to learn by doing. These are the people who like to get up and move around in the classroom. Versus at the bottom of that wheel, you've got your logic learners. These are our numbers people. These are our math people. And we've all seen that in action. We've seen that there are these different styles. And so, just looking at all of these, you see that there's a pendulum effect with some of these things. We've got internal influences versus external influences. We've got intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. We've got perception versus processing versus understanding. And there's so many things that work in this. The idea that this is going to be a little bit different for everybody is important to understand and also a little bit overwhelming. So, how can we take this appreciation of different learning styles and then do something actually productive with it? So, as I was preparing this presentation and I was talking out loud to myself in my living room, as I often do, my Google robot overheard me and answered the question of what is learning theory? And what Google told me is that learning theory describes how students absorb, process, and retain information. There are 4 elements of learning theory: cognitive, emotional, environmental, and past experiences that influence how understanding is acquired or changed, and knowledge and skills retained. And so that is the basic textbook definition of what learning theory is that we are going to start with today. That is what we know. We know that there are a lot of formalized processes and structures and models and things like that that are going to be a little bit different for everybody, but that we have these 4 domains that influence how understanding is acquired and whether knowledge is retained. So now that we know that, and we can all be coming from that same baseline of understanding, the question becomes, why do we care? Why do we care that there are all of these formalized structures and models of learning, and they all go through these 4 domains? Why do we care? Well, what do we as SI leaders care about? We care about learning. We want to create learning opportunities. And so this little sequence of events that I want you all to sort of visualize with me is that there are various learning styles and preferences that's going to be unique to everyone. And so everyone is going to be coming from this spectrum of perception going in. But then in the same way, everyone is going to be running through these 4 domains: cognitive, emotional, environmental, and past experiences. Everyone has to process through those 4 domains before we can have understanding and an insight. And that is what we as SI leaders care about. We like to see that light bulb go off. So, how can we make that happen? So one of the terms that I put on your worksheet for you to look into prior to beginning this video was the concept of instructional scaffolding. And instructional scaffolding is part of a larger learning theory that we are not going to get into today, but what the valuable bottom line of that idea is, I think, is this idea that learning happens within a zone that exists between where we are comfortable and where we are uncomfortable. And so when we're thinking about new material or new information that we're trying to understand, we have our comfort zone of everything that we already know. And if we get too far away from that, if we get out into the weeds on some subject that is just a little bit beyond us, that's panic zone, and we can't do anything productive there. What we want to do is we want to find this green zone, this learning zone that is slightly outside of our comfort zone and requires a bit of challenge on our parts, but it's not so far away from the baseline that we're starting with that we panic and lose the ability to focus and integrate new information. And so there's this spectrum between the teacher's responsibility of presenting the information and the student's responsibility for rising to the challenge. And there's going to be a spectrum that exists between those two poles. And as SI leaders, how is this concept relevant to you and your role as an SI leader? Well, what the concept of instructional scaffolding goes on to describe is this scenario in which the student will be working and learning alongside maybe a teacher, but maybe a peer, maybe just someone who is slightly above their own comfort zone in terms of abilities or knowledge. So there's, a degree of modeling that's happening where the student is sort of like watching and learning as we go through and being able to build upon the example that slightly advanced partner is providing. And that's the idea of scaffolding. If you think back to the image that I had on the title slide of this presentation with the construction workers, you think about scaffolding as a construction tool that we use. We use these basic frameworks around what will become a finished building in order to sort of establish the big picture and then provide support as we fill in the details as we go along. And I think that's just such a beautiful illustration of what SI can be. And so now that we have this formalized idea of scaffolding and we have this visual for the sweet spot, the green zone of where learning will occur, let's go back to that idea of these four elements that influence whether or not learning will occur. And let's dive into how that relates back to what we're doing here as SI leaders. So let's start with cognitive, the cognitive domain. What do we know about cognitive processes? So we know that cognitive has to do with facts, with knowledge, with intellect. This is objective in nature. It is what it is, right? This is our list of terms. These are mathematical equations. These are the facts, right? And so why do we care about including this domain? Well, obviously, this is what we're trying to learn. But what we need to recognize here is that whether learning occurs will be determined by our ability to get to the same baseline information, so that whether or not you and your students can speak the same language, so to speak. And I think the question that brings up for us then, when we're thinking about our SI planning, when we're thinking about being in session with students, is how can we establish communication and agree at the cognitive level what it is that we're talking about. The next element that I want to consider with you all is the emotional domain. So what do we know about emotions? Obviously, everyone's got them, and they're going to be different for everyone. So as opposed to the cognitive domain, where we can all look at a list of terms or a list of equations and agree that, it says what it says, emotions are always going to be subjective in nature. They're going to be unique to the individual, and they do not behave according to logic or reason. And so everyone's emotional experience in an SI session or with a particular chunk of material is going to be unique. And so why do we want to care as SI leaders? Why do we want to be aware of people's feelings about the material? And the reality is that whether learning occurs is going to be determined by the learners with the students' relationship with that material. How do they feel about having to learn that? Do they hate the professor? Are they stressed out because of something outside of class? What is going on in their emotional life that is affecting their ability to interact with this new material. And the question becomes for us, I think, is can we improve that relationship then? Can we help our students feel better about learning the material? Can we help them get excited about learning the material? Because if we can, that could make a difference for some people. So the next element that we want to consider here is the environmental element. And I apologize that this program messed with my formatting a little bit. But so what do we know about environmental elements? So what we are considering here is the external situation that we're in, setting and characters. So where are we? Are we in a room together? Are we in a Zoom meeting together? Who else is in the conversation? Do we like these people? These are the questions that we need to ask. And why do we as SI leaders care about this is because SI sessions occur in a shared environment. So yourself and your students and everyone who's agreeing to participate in your SI session, they're all having to show up in the same way to some degree. And so if you're in a physical environment, things like, do you have enough lighting? Do you have the equipment that you need? Is it too cold in here? Like questions like that are going to matter. If you are in an online environment, how easy is it for your students to access that environment? Do they feel comfortable interacting on that type of a platform? Questions like that are going to matter. And the important question that arises for you as the SI leader is, can we manipulate the environment to make learning more likely to occur? If you or your students are having struggles with external factors that's making learning more difficult for you, those are the easy things to fix. Those are the things that really, if you can just identify what they are and ask for help with them, we can make a lot of change there. So don't forget to involve your leadership and get support when you need it for those types of questions. And finally, that brings us to the element of past experiences. That obviously every individual in the room is going to be bringing their own past experiences, their own perspective into the conversation with them. And so, what we can know about this is that it's going to be an internal perspective and it's going to be unique to each individual, which means that there's no real way to know exactly what kind of perspective each person in the room has brought with them to the conversation. So, why do we care about that? Is that recognizing that whether learning occurs will be influenced by the student's ability to see the new material and to place that new material within the context of their past experiences, of their perspective that they walked in the door with. Can they see where this material fits in the big picture, and how are their past experiences coloring their ability to interact with the material today? Is this a class that the student has already failed once, and so they're having struggles with confidence in this class? Is this a subject that the student has just, always felt that they aren't good at? Maybe this is a student who is just like, oh, I'm not good at science, and they have that narrative going in their mind because of past experiences that they've had in other courses. How can we, as SI leaders, better understand where our students are coming from? And how can we help our students recognize that their past experiences and their unique perspective is valuable to the conversation that we're having here today? And so now that we all know what we're talking about with the 4 elements that influence learning, the next question is, why do we care? Why is it worth our time to be learning about this? How is this information valuable to us? Can we use these insights to help achieve our goals of facilitating learning, creating opportunities for learning, creating opportunities for our students to spend more time in the green zone? How can we accomplish that? So let's consider some practical applications of what we just went over. Thinking about our cognitive domain, we have to be able to speak the same language with our students. And so what we're talking about there, guys, is concepts and definitions. You've heard me say this 100 times if you've heard me say it once, but you have to know your definitions and those concepts that you spend time writing out every week, agreeing on what's actually important, what are the key terms in this, what's the big picture, getting your students on the same page with you with those things. That's where the magic happens. For the emotional domain, I think it's important that we establish motivation for learning the material. If cognitive is the what do we know component, emotional is definitely the why do we care component. And so that is obviously going to be a little bit different for everybody. You know, some people are going to be motivated by the grades. Some people are motivated by their career goals that they're working on. Some people, I mean, who knows? Maybe they just like the material and they're excited to be learning about it. But the bottom line is that they have to have a motivation for wanting to get into the material, and so we have an opportunity there to help identify and encourage that motivation, whatever it may be for the individual. From an environmental aspect, like we said earlier, we all need to be able to be comfortable in the space. We need to be physically comfortable. We need to be emotionally comfortable. We need to feel that this is a safe place to ask questions and to engage with the material and to get out of their comfort zone a little bit. Remembering that green comfort zone, or the green learning zone rather, is right outside of the comfort zone. And so speaking about external variables, how can we make that a safe place for students to get out of their academic comfort zone and accept a little bit of challenge? And then considering that element of past experiences, we want to remember that all of our students have a unique perspective to bring to the material, just as we do ourselves. And so, what we want to do is we want to invite our students to share their insights. Share their thoughts about the material, ask questions, because everyone's insights and perspectives are going to be valuable because they're all unique. And we want to be appreciative of the opportunity to bring a variety of perspectives into the space together, because as we said at the very beginning, our goal with SI is to create learning through creative and cooperative group study. And so we want those varied perspectives. That's very valuable to SI, and we definitely want to include that in our thought process. As far as accommodating different learning styles, my goal for this is for you guys to just realize that these different learning styles exist, you know? And so if something is not working for you, if something is not working for your students, then get creative with this and explore various approaches. Invite feedback from your students in terms of what's working for them and what's not. One thing that I find myself doing with students frequently, if they come to me and they're struggling with something, I ask them, what have you been doing at home? What is your study process? And regardless of what the answer is, maybe they read the text, maybe they make a list, whatever the answer is, the question is, how's that been working out for you? Because if it's not been working out for you and you're still struggling, then we need to be doing something different. Remember, Einstein's definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So if your students' process that they've been using is not working for them, or if your process that you've been using in your SI sessions is not working well for your students, do something different. And realize that just because something worked for you does not mean that that's going to be the best approach for someone else. And allow some creativity and allow some flexibility in your approaches there, inviting feedback from your students so that you guys can all enjoy the benefit of each other's unique perspectives. And so, as I've been working with this material, I sort of realized that what made the most sense to me was this idea that the SI leaders and all of the students involved would be able to agree that there are certain things that need to happen in order for learning to take place. And the agreements that made the most sense to me are as follows. So the cognitive agreement is that we must all agree on what we're talking about. From an intellectual standpoint, we all have to have a baseline that we can start with, and that's just really non-negotiable to the rest of the process. I can't ask a student to explain a concept to me if they haven't learned the basic vocabulary and definitions of what it is that we're talking about. We have to have a common language that we can all meet on in order to build forward. The emotional agreement that we make is that we must all agree that the information is worth learning. It is worth our time and our energy and our effort to be here today learning this material for whatever reason, because that reason is going to be different for every individual in the room. But we, the SI leaders, we understand that learning can't happen unless the learner has an intrinsic motivation, has a personal reason to integrate with this material. And that's what we want to agree is happening. The environmental agreement that we're making is that we're all going to be present together in a shared space, whether that's a physical space or a virtual space. Everyone needs to be able to feel comfortable and safe and welcome to participate, and that's the agreement that we want to make with our students. And then finally, the agreement of past experiences. We must agree that everyone in the room has valuable insights to offer, that their experiences, their unique perspective is going to enrich the conversation, and that we want to recognize each individual's potential contribution to the learning experience, and that we agree to be respectful of each other. So that just about wraps us up here. You guys are doing great. What I would ask you to do is switch back over to that worksheet that you've been following along with and look at the reflection questions at the bottom. There are 2 questions that I'm asking you there, and that is to start out with, how does this information change the way that you think about studying? So one of the pre-work questions that I asked you was how you study, how you personally get into new information. Do you start with reading the text? Do you start with making an outline? What's your process? And now that we've looked at how learning works and the different components that inform that, does that change the way that you think about your own process? Is there room for improvement there? And then the other question that I'd like you to ask yourself is, how can we use the 4 agreements in your SI sessions as you're doing your session planning, as you're considering activities, and how you're going to structure this session? How is it that we can use these agreements, the idea of these agreements, to better create common ground with our students? One of the things that I would recommend that you all do is have that conversation with your students. You don't necessarily have to do it in a real formalized way, but just letting them know that these are things that you take into account during your planning and during your strategy, and let them know that you care. Are they comfortable? Is this material just way outside of their comfort zone? What can you do to help them meet the material? And creating that moment of conversation where you and your students can come together and figure out what you all need, establish some shared goals. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. And that is the end. You made it. Great job. We got a lot done today. We learned about learning. We learned about the 4 elements that influence learning, and we talked about some practical ways that we can intentionally use that information in order to facilitate learning, which is what it's all about at the end of the day. So thank you for being here. Thank you for participating. At this point, what I would ask you to do is go back over that worksheet, and if there are any of the questions or prompts that you haven't filled out yet, go ahead and do that just for yourself. Go ahead and put those ideas that you have into words, because that is a big part of the integration process, so that you're going to be able to continue to carry this material forward with you into your sessions, into your planning process, and into your own continuing education. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for being SI leaders with ETSU. You guys are the real heroes.